Okay, so we're going to be talking about House of the Dragon. I have my brother here with me. This is going to be fun. Uh,
M-
you know
Muy
what's
bueno.
you know what's funny about this too is we talked about this when we were kids a little bit about me wanting to do YouTube videos. I didn't really even think about that until the other day. But I think first what we should do, um, this one will be a little bit longer than normal ones because we're going to discuss our thoughts briefly on Game of Thrones first. um, as brief as we can, as briefly as physically possible. And then we're going to say the show of House of the Dragon so far, and then we're going to talk spoilers of the most recent episode. So I'm going to let my little brother take it away on his thoughts for Game of Thrones first, as a whole, anyway.
My thoughts on Game of Thrones? Oh,
I'm
I mean,
doing
it's a
individual
really good
reviews
show.
for this, so you can just say stuff.
If you haven't seen Game of Thrones, you should definitely watch it. Anyone who hasn't watched it is either living under a rock or they've chosen to hate themselves. It's a very, very good show. And it actually took me a long time to get on board with it because of how long every episode is and how many episodes there are. However, if you make the commitment to watch it, you're going to enjoy it. It has something for absolutely everyone. You don't have to enjoy even the fantasy genre to enjoy Game of Thrones. If you like The Sopranos, there's a decent chance you'll like Game of Thrones. If you like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, there's a decent chance you will like Game of Thrones. No, they don't tie in any way. However, you will still like Game of Thrones.
It's What's funny about that too is it doesn't even really have that many fantasy elements until later.
No,
Like,
magic is so pushed off to the side, you forget that it's a thing.
and you kind of wonder if it's even real until you see the demon baby thing. Then you're like, oh yeah, no, that's totally There's no, yeah, no, that was real. But
Well,
uh, which
God's made of fire.
for any of you worried about spoilers, me saying that, you will still not see what I'm talking about coming. I promise you. Um, Even though I said that, it does not matter. I assure you. Um, my brief thoughts on Game of Thrones is that it is a phenomenal show that is legendary for a reason. Now, I'm going to be pretty brief on this because I'm actually going to be doing reviews for Game of Thrones each season. But if you want just my general synopsis, I love this show. I think it's phenomenal. I was excited as fuck when they announced a sequel, not a sequel, a prequel, sorry. And I just think it's a phenomenal series. It really is. The characters are interesting. Nobody's ever really strictly good or bad, and the ones that are either punished or you change their mind about them at some point. One of
The whole
mm,
I think the whole point of Game of Thrones is that nobody's necessarily good or bad, but everyone acts out of their own personal gain. Like that's what everybody's working towards is their own
right,
personal gain until something happens that changes that path for them.
right. There's spoiler free. There's a character in the first season, I won't say who, that you believe is like the main villain, but you come to learn that there's more to it than that, and it changes your perception, and it makes for my favorite character. For those of you that have seen it, you probably already know who I'm talking about, but really is a phenomenal show. Please watch it. It's super good. Like I said, I'm gonna be doing reviews for it individually, so each season individually. So if this goes well, so it doesn't really, I'll be pretty brief, but I think it's phenomenal and worth watching. And now we're going to talk our thoughts for House of the Dragon so far. And this is going to be a spoiler free part. And then we're going to talk full spoilers after that. So, House of the Dragon essentially is takes place what 175 years before or something like that, isn't it?
Maybe more than that.
Maybe a little more than that.
It's
It's
at least that much.
it's at least that much. It's a good chunk before Game of Thrones even starts. So it's very much a prequel. So if you wanted to watch it without having seen Game of Thrones, I think you can, but I kind of don't recommend it because there's a lot of context that you get as a fan that you might not get necessarily unless you have already seen the show. But it takes
Dancing
place.
is similar to swordplay.
Do what?
Dancing is similar to swordplay.
That was
It was a
random.
reference they made in the most recent episode to the original series.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I forgot. Um, there's so much in that episode I want to talk about, so we'll get to that in a minute. But overall thoughts so far, I love it. I think it's cool. I don't. It's hard to say how it stacks versus Game of Thrones because this show had a bit of an unfair start because the ending to Game of Thrones, if you don't already know, is pretty disappointing. Um, to say the least, for some people, myself included. But I still highly recommend you watch the show. Just kind of know that going in, and I think that you'll like it more. So
The
this,
ending
go ahead.
also isn't as disappointing if you get to watch it all the way through the first time. One of the things that made the ending so disappointing for so many people was that they had to wait so long for it. But I started watching Game of Thrones as they were making the very last season. I think right as they finished it, like right after it was over, like maybe a week after it was over.
Oh wow.
And because I didn't have to wait for any seasons or any episodes at all, it made it feel like the biggest issue that most people had was the payoff, but it wasn't built up as much for me because I didn't have to wait as long.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think the problem with it is it's not so much the decisions that they made. I think it's more that it's more about them not having time to breathe. Uh, except for who inevitably becomes king. Again, no spoilers, but for those of you that have seen it, you already know who I'm talking about. Um, I just don't. I firmly disagree with some of the decisions they made, but like if they were built up too naturally, I think it would have worked, and I think people wouldn't have complained.
If they had turned the last season
Into like
into 2 or 3 seasons, with the amount of things that happen in just the last season alone, it would have been received much, much better.
oh yeah, I could not agree more. And that really was a problem because you see, for me, for anybody who knows me knows that I was really into Game of Thrones from like season, I'd like to say 4 onward. I heard about it and I jumped and I neglected it. I was like, it can't be that good. I was wrong. Um, but because the issue is that season like 5 onward, they ran out of books to use from George because George R. R. Martin is kind of lazy and doesn't really like writing anymore. Uh,
It's a process.
it's a process that takes him 12 years to write a book. Ugh, it's so dumb.
He just wants to make it perfect.
I agree with that to an extent, but he's like out here writing Elden Ring and all this other stuff. Just I don't know. I don't know. But the point is they ran out of source material to use, and so that made it a little bit difficult for them to write because they aren't George. George is very smart. He's a very good writer to such an insane degree, apparently. Because some of these
I think
characters shock me how deep they are.
I think it's also important to note that our opinions come from 2 people who have not read the books all the way through
Mm-hmm.
and have not read Fire and Blood specifically.
Yes. I know part of the highlights of what happened in Fire and Blood because I had heard about it from some friends who have read it, but I have not in fact read it, and neither of us have. He read. You said you read the first 2.
The first 2 and a portion of the third, and they're so long, and there's so much stuff in each book that is really filler, kind of boring, kind
Mhm.
of not important. There's also like really important conversations that happen that take up, 2 scenes on screen, but take up, 30 some pages in the book. You know what I mean?
Right.
Um, so, and George R. R. Martin, he rates these books more readable than Tolkien, but less readable than like C.S. Lewis.
See, you're a bit bigger of a book guy than I ever was. I read some fantasy, but I'm not really a big book reader. I'm a comic book reader. I like pictures. No, I'm just kidding. But oh god, that sounds like dad. But he likes different pictures. But no, it's a phenomenal show. You really should watch Game of Thrones. But House of the Dragon, however, is based on a book called Fire and Blood, which, as far as I understand it, is pretty much just a book about the history of Westeros, if I'm not mistaken.
More informational, I think, less story.
Yeah, it's more, yeah. And so you have essentially the plot synopsis of the show is Viserys Targaryen is the current king of the current king of the Seven Kingdoms and protector of the realm, and he very clearly is not well. They don't really describe exactly what it is, but it's kind of clear that he's not okay. um, and essentially, what he's trying to do is he's trying to get a male heir to pass the kingdom to. One thing leads to another, and it ends up being his daughter instead, Queen Rhaenyra instead, and that causes its own problems. And there's also his brother Daemon, who is very reckless and kind of dangerous. Kind of does what he wants, but there's a lot more to him than that. And there's a lot of moving political pieces here that I think make it a fascinating show and reminds me to the best of Game of Thrones. Although I don't think it's reached the best of Game of Thrones yet, but it's season 1. I don't expect it to yet. So that's just kind of
I
my
think
thoughts.
I think House of the Dragon thus far is at the same level that Game of Thrones was at the time. Do you know what I mean? As
In
I'm
You
watching,
think season
I'm
1 of
I'm the
House
same
is
amount of
equal
excited.
to season 1 of Game of Thrones?
Yeah, thus
Right.
far, if I'm on episode 5 of Game of Thrones, I would say actually that I'm less interested than I am in House of the Dragon. Because it took multiple episodes for Game of Thrones to become really interesting, and House of the Dragon really just starts that way. Like, it starts interesting. The very first episode, things start happening that are like, oh my goodness.
Right.
So,
You're like, holy shit, this could be a really cool show. Um,
right.
and it is. There's dragons here. uh, Like there's political intrigue. There's very well written dialogue. Sometimes more than others. But for the most part, it is a phenomenally written show, and they did a fantastic job. And if you, this is kind of a sidestep, but if you want a good example, me and my brother talked about this at one point, where we said if you want a good example of female empowerment, Rhaenyra is how you do it, because this woman is super interesting to me, and she's one of my favorite characters.
She's the exact definition.
Yeah, it is
She's
just
the
awesome.
exact- If you want to make a story that's inclusive and involves putting women in positions of power within the story, um, then this is definitely the way to do it.
Because like at no point did I ever feel like she didn't know what she was talking about, or that she was just being rude for the sake of rude, unless it was just within her character to do so. Um, like it was very well done, and I love her character arc that she's going through so far. Um, I'm trying not to spoil stuff, and but I think my favorite character probably so far, to the surprise of absolutely no one, is probably still Daemon Targaryen.
Yeah, lots of people really like Damon. Damon's pretty cool. Damon's not as involved as you think he's going to be. I wish he was in the show a little bit more because he is a super cool character,
Yeah.
and pretty much everything he's in is really interesting. Um, I don't know if I have a favorite character so far, but Rhaenyra's pretty great. And I also like Alicent Hightower a lot. She's also very, very intriguing.
I do as well. She's a very subtle character. She's a character that um, you kind of have to pay attention to what her facial expressions are. Um, Not like in a bad way, in a good way. It's done very well. Like she doesn't say as much as you might think that she would say, but she speaks a lot with her face. And
Yeah.
I think that's very very good, especially in this most recent episode. But we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yep. I don't really have anything else to say about House of the Dragon
Right,
without spoiling anything.
right. I was also getting to that in a minute, but let me put it this way: if you could rate, because we're halfway through the season, this is our first video on it. There's going to be, let's see, about 5 more videos, give or take. I think there's going to be 10 episodes, if I'm not mistaken. If you could rate it, let's say right now, like assuming that season ended here, it didn't, obviously, but like what out of 10 are you wanting to put it at?
9. Solid 9.
You know, honestly, I'm kind of thinking the same thing. It's got to be a solid 9.
I
I'm
only
fluctuating
have
between 8 and
one
a 9.
small issue.
Is it a spoiler issue?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, we'll
Well,
talk about it in a
kinda.
minute. We'll talk about it in a minute then. If you can say it without spoilers, you're allowed to do so.
I mean, it doesn't really spoil anything. It's just kind of a lack of things to spoil, rather. I really, really wish, and keep in mind, the show is called House of the Dragon. I really wish that we could see more of the other houses. It is very, very, very focused on the Targaryen household. And like I said just a
That's
second
true.
ago, it's called House of the Dragon. So it's not necessarily like a real issue. It's just I want to see some Starks. I want to see some Starks really badly.
Right, me too. It's kind of weird that they reduced them to essentially cameos. They only showed a Stark in episode 1 when they were like swearing fealty, and it was super brief too. Like they mentioned all the houses we like Baratheon, Lannister, Stark. Uh, fuck, who else?
Valerian.
Valerian. Uh, the Dornish, I think, were there probably too. Maybe I could be wrong about that though. But the point is that they very much focus on the Targaryen household. So those of you that are fans of the Targaryens and stuff, this is your show. This is very much your show. Just don't expect a whole lot of Starks or like anybody from the Iron Islands. None of that. Like they're not in this show really.
I'm not positive that the Iron Islands were that wasn't Greyjoy back then, was it?
That would have been House Greyjoy, but I don't know for sure if they had it back then. He made it sound like they did. I think.
I thought the Iron Islands was around where the crab feeder was.
Oh, maybe. That's an interesting point. I'll look into that at some point. Um, but the point is, it's very much the Targaryen show here, and I'm not complaining. I like it. I think it's an excellent show, but it's really kind of a nitpick because Game of Thrones centers around the main character for Game of Thrones is Westeros as a whole.
Absolutely.
It's not so much a single character or characters. It's Westeros. You see several parts of the world at the same time. Very
House
different
Stark
backgrounds
gets
and
the
stuff.
favor for sure, though.
100%, yeah, but well, I won't say that because it's a spoiler. But there's a lot of people die in this show. Okay, if you watch Game of Thrones, you just got to keep that in mind. Um, but it's phenomenal. Please watch it. Okay, so I don't think I made it very clear. with the video. My rating for this show so far, I wasn't sure if I said it or not, so I wanted to include this in case I didn't, is definitely a 9 out of 10. This show is phenomenal. Please watch it. It really is good, especially if you like Game of Thrones. I know we were all a little hurt by season 8, but I am telling you, this show fixes that problem. Okay? It really is good. But anyway, this is my first foray into YouTube stuff. I would like to do more. I'm not entirely sure how to do some of this, so this is very much me learning. So if there's little things that may not quite be right, or any constructive being the key word, criticism, I'm more than happy to accept it. So if there's anything there you would like to say, just put it in the comments below. I want to hear it, and I will be reading them. So I appreciate the hell out of you guys, and I will talk to you next time, and be sure to follow me on Twitch. Have a good one.